It was a crisp autumn morning in the heart of fictional town, a quiet place where the rustle of fallen leaves often drowned out the distant hum of city life. The downtown area bustled with its usual charm, shopkeepers setting up window displays, joggers enjoying their morning routes, and coffee shops alive with the chatter of regulars. Officer Jack Reynolds, a seasoned patrolman nearing the end of his shift, navigated his cruiser through the familiar streets. For Jack, today was supposed to be just another routine day on the job. Jack was a man of habit, his life revolving around the order and predictability his badge offered him. The son of a factory worker and a homemaker, he'd grown up in a conservative household in this very town. His father had taught him that respect and hard work were the bedrocks of a man's character. But there were lessons Jack had absorbed more subtly, lessons about staying vigilant and being cautious of outsiders. These unspoken beliefs shaped his worldview, though he rarely questioned them. As he turned a corner onto the main street, his eyes caught sight of a sleek black SUV parked slightly askew near a no-parking zone in front of a popular coffee shop. The vehicle was imposing, almost too polished for this part of town. Jack's cop instincts flared. He slowed his cruiser, his gaze narrowing as he scanned the scene. Behind the tinted windows of the SUV, he spotted the silhouette of a man sitting motionless in the driver's seat. The figure seemed calm, but something about the situation felt off to Jack. It wasn't the first time he had seen expensive cars parked where they shouldn't be. Sometimes it was a careless tourist, other times something more. Jack parked his cruiser a few feet away and approached the SUV. As he walked up, he adjusted his belt, ensuring his badge gleamed in the sunlight. His footsteps crunched against the gravelly pavement, a sound that seemed to amplify in the otherwise serene street. Reaching the driver's side window, he tapped on the glass twice, firm but not aggressive. The window rolled down smoothly, revealing a man whose presence was as commanding as the vehicle he drove. "Good morning, officer," the man said, his voice deep and calm, carrying the cadence of someone used to being in control. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt with a neatly pressed blazer hanging over the passenger seat. His posture was straight, his gaze steady. There was no sign of panic or guilt, only quiet composure. "Morning," Jack replied, his tone neutral but clipped. "You're parked in a no-parking zone. I'm going to need to see your license and registration." The man nodded and reached into the glove compartment with deliberate movements, pulling out a leather wallet and a neatly folded document. "Of course," he said, handing them over. "I wasn't planning to stay long. Just grabbing a quick coffee." Jack's eyes flicked to the name on the license, Samuel Hayes. Something about the name rang a faint bell, but he didn't dwell on it. Instead, he studied Hayes more closely. His demeanor, his clothes, even his impeccable posture, it all screamed someone who was used to privilege, at least in Jack's eyes. And yet, there was something else. An air of quiet authority that Jack couldn't quite place. But his suspicion lingered, fueled not by anything Hayes had done, but by an unconscious bias Jack wasn't fully aware he carried. "Well, Mr. Hayes," Jack began, his tone hardening slightly, "rules are rules. You can't park here, even for a minute." "I understand," Hayes said, his tone unchanging. "But if I may, officer, this seems a bit excessive. Surely a warning would suffice?" Jack stiffened. Something about Hayes's calm defiance grated on him. It wasn't disrespectful, but it wasn't deferential either. "I'm not here to argue, sir," he replied, his hand moving instinctively to his radio. "Step out of the vehicle, please." A flicker of surprise crossed Hayes's face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Is that really necessary?" he asked, his voice still even, though there was a subtle shift in his gaze, a flash of steel. "It is if I say it is," Jack shot back, his own frustration beginning to show. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not like this. The tension in the air was palpable now, and a small crowd had begun to gather at a safe distance, their curiosity piqued by the sight of a cop and a man in an expensive suit locked in a standoff. Hayes sighed, unbuckling his seatbelt and stepping out of the SUV with measured grace. As he stood, Jack realized for the first time just how tall and broad Hayes was. He wasn't just imposing, he was commanding. And yet, his movements were calm, almost too calm, as though he were deliberately trying not to escalate the situation. "Hands where I can see them," Jack ordered, his voice sharper than intended. Hayes complied, raising his hands slightly, his expression unreadable. At that moment, a young woman in the crowd raised her phone, capturing the scene on video. "What's he done?" she called out, her voice ringing with indignation. Others began murmuring, some muttering about racial profiling, while a few stood silently, their faces tense. "Sir," Hayes said, his voice low but firm, "before this goes any further, I think it's important you know who I am." Jack scoffed. "I don't care who you are. The law applies to everyone." "True," Hayes said, his gaze steady. "But it might save us both some trouble if you check the name on that license again." Jack frowned, glancing down at the license still in his hand. The name clicked this time. Samuel Hayes. Major General Samuel Hayes. The name he'd heard mentioned on the news just days ago. A decorated U.S. Army veteran, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, and one of the most respected leaders in the military. A hometown hero. For a brief moment, Jack froze, the weight of his mistake crashing down on him. But pride and years of conditioning wouldn't let him back down easily. "Military or not," he said, his voice faltering slightly, "you're not above the law." Hayes didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Officer, I'm not looking for special treatment. But this isn't about a parking violation anymore, is it?" Jack's face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and defiance. The crowd was growing restless, their murmurs louder now, and the young woman with the phone was still recording. The pressure was mounting, and Jack knew he had a decision to make. But in his mind, the situation had already spiraled out of control, and there was no easy way to salvage it. What Jack didn't know was that this moment, this seemingly routine encounter, was about to become a catalyst for something far greater than either of them could have imagined. Officer Jack Reynolds couldn't shake the weight of the moment as the crowd around him swelled. People whispered, phones pointed, and the air buzzed with tension. In the back of his mind, the name Major General Samuel Hayes repeated like a warning bell, but his pride kept him planted. His training told him to stay in control, yet everything about this situation felt out of his hands. Samuel Hayes, meanwhile, remained calm, standing tall and composed. To those watching, he wasn't just a man facing an officer's scrutiny, he was a presence, one that demanded respect without a single raised word. But as composed as Hayes appeared, there was a storm brewing beneath the surface. This wasn't his first encounter with prejudice dressed as authority, and it likely wouldn't be his last. Still, he wasn't here to fan flames. He had returned to his hometown for peace, for reflection, not to be the center of a standoff in the streets. The tension between them was almost tangible, each man silently weighing his next move. Jack, despite his mounting unease, felt a familiar stubbornness dig its heels in. It was a defense mechanism, the product of years spent trying to prove himself in a town where he was often overlooked. To back down now would feel like admitting failure, not just today, but to every quiet judgment he'd faced over the years. For Hayes, the stakes were higher. He had spent decades leading soldiers, making decisions that held lives in the balance. His composure was hard-earned, shaped by experience and responsibility. Yet, standing here, facing Jack's hardened stance, he felt an all-too-familiar frustration bubbling up. This wasn't about a parking ticket, it was about something deeper, something Hayes thought he'd left behind. As the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, Hayes made a calculated decision. He took a slow, deliberate breath and addressed the officer with the same commanding tone he'd used in countless briefings. "Officer Reynolds," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm asking you to take a moment and think about what you're doing. Not for me, but for yourself. This situation doesn't have to escalate. Jack's jaw tightened. The directness of Hayes's words felt like a challenge, even though they were measured. Are you trying to tell me how to do my job? He shot back, his voice louder than he intended. I'm not telling you anything, Hayes replied calmly. I'm reminding you of something you already know. You're better than this moment, officer. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For a split second, Jack hesitated. He wanted to snap back, to reassert control, but something about Hayes's tone disarmed him. It wasn't arrogance, it was conviction. Jack glanced at the crowd, their eyes burning into him, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of their judgment. Still, his pride wouldn't let him concede. He motioned for Hayes to move to the side of the vehicle, hoping to defuse the situation without admitting fault. Step over here, Jack said, his voice firm but no longer confrontational. Hayes complied without resistance, his movements deliberate and calm. As he stepped away from the SUV, he noticed a young boy in the crowd, no older than 8, holding his mother's hand and watching intently. The sight stirred something in Hayes, a reminder of why he'd come back to this town in the first place. He'd wanted to give back to the community that had raised him, to inspire the next generation. But moments like these made him wonder if that was even possible. Jack began running Hayes's license and registration through the system, hoping the routine action would buy him time to regain his composure. But as he stared at the computer screen in his cruiser, the confirmation of Hayes's identity felt like a gut punch. The database didn't just list Samuel Hayes as a retired major general, it outlined his commendations, his years of service, his sacrifices. The man standing in front of him wasn't just a local returning home, he was a hero, one whose story was etched into the very fabric of the nation. Jack swallowed hard, his hands gripping the steering wheel as the realization hit him. He'd made a mistake, one that was now unfolding in front of half the town. His stomach churned as he imagined the headlines, the fallout, the questions he'd have to answer. But even more unsettling was the gnawing feeling that Hayes had been right. This wasn't about a parking violation, and it never had been. Meanwhile, Hayes stood quietly by his SUV, his expression unreadable. To the crowd, he appeared unshaken, but inside, he was grappling with a familiar mix of anger and resignation. He'd been in countless high-stakes situations, but this, standing accused on the streets of his own hometown, felt different. It was a reminder that no amount of medals or accolades could shield him from prejudice. As Jack stepped out of the cruiser, the crowd seemed to hold its breath. He walked toward Hayes, his expression carefully neutral, but the tension in his shoulders was impossible to hide. Everything checks out, Jack said, his voice low, almost begrudging. You're free to go. Hayes nodded, but he didn't move to leave. Instead, he met Jack's gaze, his eyes steady and unyielding. Thank you, officer, he said, his tone polite but pointed. I hope this moment gives you something to think about. The crowd murmured, their collective judgment still hanging in the air as Hayes climbed back into his SUV. Jack stood frozen, his mind racing as he watched the vehicle pull away. He knew this moment wasn't over, not for him, not for Hayes, and certainly not for the town. As the crowd began to disperse, the young boy who had been watching with his mother tugged at her hand. Mom, he said, his voice filled with curiosity, who was that man? His mother knelt down, her eyes still fixed on the spot where Hayes had stood. That's General Samuel Hayes, she said softly, her voice tinged with awe. He's a hero. The boy looked up at her, his eyes wide. But why was the policeman mad at him? She hesitated, searching for the right words. Sometimes, she said finally, people make mistakes. But heroes, they teach us how to be better. Jack overheard the exchange, the boy's innocent question cutting through him like a knife. He turned back toward his cruiser, his mind swirling with thoughts he couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about something bigger, something he couldn't yet fully understand. But one thing was certain, this day, this moment, would follow him for a long time to come. The next morning, the town of Fictional Town woke to a storm they weren't prepared for. The scene between Officer Jack Reynolds and Major General Samuel Hayes had been captured on multiple cell phones and was now circulating across social media. Videos of the confrontation painted a stark picture, showing the composed demeanor of the decorated veteran contrasted with the visibly tense officer. The captions on these posts weren't kind, with phrases like "profiling in broad daylight" and "local hero disrespected by police" quickly gaining traction. By the time the morning news picked up the story, it had already ignited heated debates online and in coffee shops across town. Jack sat in his living room, staring at the TV as a news anchor replayed the footage for what felt like the 100th time. His stomach churned as he listened to the commentary. Some pundits condemned him outright, accusing him of racial profiling and abusing his authority. Others took a more measured approach, suggesting it was a misunderstanding that escalated unnecessarily. Jack's wife, Karen, stood silently behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder. She didn't say much, she didn't need to. The look in her eyes said everything. "This is serious, Jack. This isn't going to blow over." Jack ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts a chaotic mix of anger, defensiveness, and guilt. He told himself he had done nothing wrong. He had followed protocol, hadn't he? And yet, he couldn't shake the image of Hayes's calm, piercing gaze or the words he had left him with, "This doesn't have to escalate. You're better than this moment." Meanwhile, across town, General Samuel Hayes sat at the kitchen table of his childhood home. The modest house was filled with memories of his upbringing, of simpler times before the weight of the world had found its way onto his shoulders. The old, worn photo albums on the shelf spoke of a family history rooted in perseverance and pride, but today the house felt quieter than usual, weighed down by the events of the day before. Hayes's phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, reporters, former colleagues, and even distant acquaintances who suddenly felt compelled to reach out. But Hayes ignored most of them. He wasn't interested in adding fuel to the fire. What bothered him most wasn't the officer's actions or even the crowd's reactions, it was the boy he'd seen in the audience, the way his young face had been filled with questions too big for him to understand yet. That boy reminded Hayes of himself at that age, back when he still believed in the world's fairness. As Hayes stared out the window, his sister Angela walked into the room, her arms crossed and her expression equal parts concern and frustration. "Sam," she began, her voice firm, "you can't just sit here and ignore this. People are talking, and this town needs to hear from you." "I'm not trying to make this bigger than it already is," Hayes replied, his tone calm but weary. "The last thing this town needs is more division." "But they need leadership," Angela countered. "They need to know what you stand for. You didn't come back here to blend into the background, did you?" Hayes sighed, leaning back in his chair. She wasn't wrong. He had returned to Fictional Town with a purpose, to reconnect, to help heal old wounds, and to inspire the next generation. But he hadn't anticipated being thrust into the spotlight like this. Still, he knew Angela was right, staying silent wasn't an option. By midday, the story had reached national headlines. News crews began setting up in front of the police station and outside Hayes's family home. The mayor, blindsided by the sudden attention, called an emergency meeting to discuss the incident. Inside the station, Jack sat in the briefing room, his face pale as the chief addressed the assembled officers. "This situation is a powder keg," Chief Donovan said, his voice stern. "We can't afford any missteps. Officer Reynolds, you're on administrative leave until we can sort this out." Jack felt the floor drop out from under him. "Administrative leave," he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I didn't do anything wrong." "That's not the point," Donovan shot back. "This is about perception, Jack. Right now, you're the face of a story that's spiraling out of control. We need to contain it before it gets worse." As Jack left the station that afternoon, his mind was a whirlwind of anger and confusion. The weight of public scrutiny bore down on him in a way he'd never experienced before. He'd always thought of himself as a good cop, someone who followed the rules and did his job with integrity. But now, his entire career felt like it was hanging by a thread, and he didn't know how to fix it. On the other side of town, Hayes made his decision. That evening, he stepped onto the steps of City Hall, where a crowd had gathered along with members of the press. Dressed in a simple blazer and slacks, he approached the podium with the calm authority that had defined his military career. The murmurs of the crowd quieted as he began to speak. "Yesterday," Hayes began, his deep voice carrying over the crowd, "I found myself in a situation that I never expected to encounter here, in my hometown, a place that I have always held close to my heart. What happened yesterday was not just about me or Officer Reynolds. It was about something much bigger. It was about trust, understanding, and the gaps that still exist in our society." The crowd listened intently, hanging on his every word. Hayes didn't focus on blame or anger. Instead, he spoke about the need for accountability and reconciliation. He shared a story from his time in the military, about a young soldier who had made a mistake but had grown from it because he was given the chance to learn. "I believe in second chances," Hayes said, his gaze steady as he addressed the crowd. "I believe that we all have the capacity to be better. But that starts with honesty, with looking at ourselves and asking how we can change." His words resonated deeply, not just with the audience but with those watching at home. Jack, sitting in his living room with Karen, watched the speech unfold on the evening news. For the first time since the incident, he felt something other than defensiveness. He felt shame. Hayes wasn't vilifying him, he was challenging him. And that, Jack realized, was far harder to face. As the night fell, the town buzzed with discussions about the speech. Hayes's words had struck a chord, sparking conversations not just about the incident but about the town's deeper issues. And while the storm was far from over, a new possibility began to take shape, a chance for healing, for growth, and for understanding. But whether that chance would be seized remained to be seen. The days following General Hayes's speech were like watching a small town learn to navigate its reflection. Conversations buzzed in diners, barber shops, and grocery aisles, ranging from heated debates to quiet self-reflection. Social media became a battleground, with locals weighing in on the controversy that had put their town on the map. Some stood staunchly in support of Officer Reynolds, framing the incident as a simple misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Others rallied around General Hayes, seeing him as a symbol of dignity and resilience in the face of injustice. Yet, beneath the noise, there was a shared undercurrent of discomfort, an unspoken acknowledgement that the town couldn't go back to pretending everything was fine. For Jack Reynolds, the time away from the police force was both a relief and a torment. Without the uniform to shield him, he felt exposed, vulnerable in ways he hadn't experienced since his rookie days. Each morning, he found himself scrolling through the online comments, a masochistic ritual that only deepened his frustration. He wasn't the racist villain some were making him out to be. At least, he didn't think he was. But the doubts crept in like unwelcome guests, whispering questions he didn't know how to answer. Was he really just following protocol that day? Or had he let his biases, ones he hadn't even acknowledged, cloud his judgment? Jack's wife, Karen, watched him wrestle with these questions from the sidelines. She had always admired his sense of duty, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. But now, that confidence seemed fractured, and she wasn't sure how to help him put the pieces back together. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of their living room, she finally broke the silence. "Jack," she said softly, "have you thought about talking to him? To General Hayes?" Jack looked up from his coffee, his expression guarded. "What good would that do?" he muttered. "The guy probably hates me." "I don't think he does," Karen replied. "Did you hear his speech? He's not out to ruin you, Jack. He just wants something to change. And maybe you do too. Her words lingered long after she'd gone to bed. Jack sat in the dimly lit room, staring at the empty coffee cup in his hands. The idea of facing Hayes made his stomach churn, but deep down, he knew Karen was right. Avoiding the man wouldn't make the doubts go away. If anything, it would only give them more power. Across town, General Hayes was busy trying to avoid the chaos that had engulfed his life since the incident. He spent his mornings walking the old trails near his family home, seeking solace in the quiet rustle of leaves and the chirping of birds. But even here, the weight of the town's scrutiny followed him. Strangers would stop him to offer their support or ask for selfies, their well-meaning gestures only serving to remind him of how far his life had strayed from the peace he'd sought in retirement. One afternoon, as he returned from one of these walks, Hayes found a familiar figure waiting for him on the porch. Jack Reynolds stood stiffly, his hands jammed into his jacket pockets, his eyes fixed on the ground as if the weathered planks beneath him held all the answers. Hayes paused at the bottom of the steps, studying the man who had, knowingly or not, become his unwitting adversary. "Officer Reynolds," Hayes said evenly, his voice carrying no hint of malice. "What brings you here?" Jack looked up, his face a mix of determination and discomfort. "I needed to talk to you," he said. "If you're willing to hear me out." Hayes nodded, gesturing toward the porch swing. "Let's talk." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the creak of the swing chains filling the air. Jack took a deep breath, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. "I messed up," he began, his voice low. "That day. I let my pride get in the way. I wasn't trying to disrespect you or target you, but looking back, I see how it came across. And for that, I'm sorry." Hayes studied Jack, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate the apology," he said finally. "But this isn't just about me. It's about what that moment represented, for both of us and for this town. Do you understand that?" Jack nodded slowly. "I think I'm starting to. It's been hard, seeing how people reacted, hearing what they think of me. But maybe I needed to hear it. Maybe I needed to face the parts of myself I've been ignoring." For the first time, Hayes's stern expression softened. He saw in Jack the glimmers of something he valued deeply, humility and a willingness to grow. "Self-reflection isn't easy," Hayes said. "But it's the first step toward change. And change is what this town needs." They talked for hours, their conversation weaving through topics of bias, responsibility, and the power of second chances. Hayes shared stories from his military career, of moments when he'd faced his own blind spots and had to confront uncomfortable truths. Jack, in turn, opened up about the pressures of his job, the weight of expectations, and the fear of making mistakes. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the porch in twilight, the two men had found a common ground they hadn't thought possible. The following week, the town gathered for a community forum organized by Hayes. Held in the high school gymnasium, the event drew an unprecedented crowd, with people spilling into the hallways and standing along the walls. Hayes stood at the center of the room, flanked by Jack and other local leaders, ready to address the questions and concerns that had been bubbling since the incident. "This isn't about pointing fingers," Hayes began, his voice steady and commanding. "It's about listening to one another, learning from our mistakes, and finding a way forward together." The forum was raw and honest, with residents sharing their experiences of prejudice, misunderstanding, and the desire for a better future. Jack, to his credit, didn't shy away from the hard questions directed at him. He admitted his shortcomings, expressed his commitment to learning, and promised to use his role as an officer to bridge the divides in the community. By the end of the night, something remarkable had begun to take shape. The tension that had gripped the town loosened, replaced by a cautious but hopeful sense of unity. Hayes's leadership and Jack's vulnerability had sparked a movement, one that would take time and effort to sustain but had the potential to transform the town in ways no one had anticipated. As Hayes walked back to his car that night, he spotted the young boy from the crowd that day standing with his mother. The boy's eyes lit up when he saw him, and he waved enthusiastically. Hayes smiled, waving back. For the first time since his return, he felt like he'd made a difference. Not just for himself, but for the town he still believed in. And maybe, just maybe, for the generations yet to come. In the months following the community forum, Fictional Town began to undergo a transformation. What had initially been a town gripped by tension and polarized opinions slowly shifted into a place where conversations flourished. While not everyone saw eye to eye, the forum had planted seeds of change, seeds nurtured by the actions of both General Hayes and Officer Reynolds. Their personal journey of reconciliation became a catalyst for broader change, inspiring others to look inward and confront their own biases and assumptions. General Hayes, despite his initial reluctance, became a central figure in the town's efforts to heal. He worked closely with local leaders to establish a series of workshops focused on cultural awareness, empathy, and conflict resolution. These workshops weren't just about addressing racial issues, they explored economic disparities, generational divides, and the shared challenges that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Hayes believed in the power of storytelling, often opening each session with tales from his own life or the lives of those he'd served with in the military. His anecdotes, sometimes humorous, sometimes heart-wrenching, had a way of breaking down walls and building bridges. Jack Reynolds, meanwhile, took a different but equally important path. After returning to duty, he made it his mission to rebuild trust with the community he had sworn to protect. Gone was the stoic officer who hid behind a badge, in his place was a man willing to admit his flaws and learn from them. Jack spearheaded a series of ride-along programs, inviting community members to experience a day in the life of a police officer. The initiative was met with some skepticism at first, but over time, it became a powerful tool for fostering understanding. Parents brought their children, teenagers came with friends, and even some of Jack's harshest critics participated, leaving with a newfound appreciation for the challenges of the job. One particularly memorable ride-along involved a young high school student named Malik, who had been vocal about his distrust of the police. Jack was nervous as he picked Malik up that morning, unsure of how the day would unfold. But as the hours passed, the two found themselves deep in conversation, discussing everything from music and sports to the complex dynamics of authority and respect. By the end of the day, Malik surprised Jack by shaking his hand and saying, "I get it now. It's not easy, what you do. But I'm glad you're trying to make it better." For Hayes, one of the most rewarding moments came when he was approached by the mayor to help design a youth mentorship program. Drawing on his military background, Hayes envisioned a program that combined leadership training with community service, teaching young people the value of discipline, empathy, and perseverance. The program, aptly named Bridge Builders, quickly gained traction, attracting participants from all walks of life. Hayes personally mentored a group of teens, sharing his wisdom and encouraging them to dream bigger than the confines of their circumstances. Among his men's was the same young boy he had noticed in the crowd on the day of the incident. The boy, named Jordan, flourished under Hayes's guidance, transforming from a quiet observer into a confident young leader. Despite the progress being made, the journey wasn't without its setbacks. Not everyone was ready to embrace change. Some in the community clung to their grievances, viewing the efforts as performative or unnecessary. On more than one occasion, Hayes and Jack faced hostility, from angry letters to outright confrontations at public events. But both men had grown accustomed to the resistance and saw it as a reminder of why their work was so important. Change, they knew, was rarely comfortable. One evening, Jack found himself standing on the front steps of Hayes's home. It had become something of a ritual for the two men to meet periodically, sharing updates and strategizing about the town's ongoing efforts. As they sat on the porch swing, Hayes handed Jack a cold glass of sweet tea, a knowing smile on his face. "You're looking less haunted these days," Hayes remarked. Jack chuckled, shaking his head. I think I've finally stopped seeing myself as the villain in every conversation. It's funny, when this all started, I thought I'd lose everything. But now, I feel like I've gained more than I ever imagined. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Growth has a way of surprising us, he said. The real challenge is what comes next. It's easy to make noise when the spotlight's on you. But the work doesn't stop when the cameras go away. Their conversation drifted into reflections on the past few months, the people they had met, the lives they had touched, and the lessons they had learned. Hayes shared a story about a letter he had received from a young woman who had attended one of his workshops. In the letter, she thanked him for helping her understand her own prejudices and for inspiring her to be more open-minded. Jack, in turn, talked about a family who had come to one of his ride-alongs and later sent him a thank you card, complete with drawings from their kids. These small moments, they agreed, were proof that their efforts were making a difference. As the evening wore on, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the sounds of laughter and conversation from nearby houses. The town, for all its imperfections, was finding its rhythm again. Hayes and Jack sat in comfortable silence, their shared experiences forging a bond that neither of them had anticipated. In that moment, they weren't a general and a cop, they were simply two men who had chosen to face their fears, embrace their humanity, and work toward a future that was better than the past. The town of Fictional Town wasn't perfect, far from it. But it was changing, slowly and steadily, one conversation, one connection, and one act of kindness at a time. And while the road ahead was still long, the people of the town were learning that they didn't have to walk it alone. Together, they were building a bridge, one that could withstand the weight of their shared history and carry them toward a brighter, more hopeful tomorrow. The first anniversary of the infamous arrest approached, and the town found itself at another crossroads. To some, the date symbolized a scar, a reminder of the tensions and divisions that had gripped the community. But to others, it was a marker of transformation, a moment to reflect on how far they had come. The idea to hold a commemorative event emerged organically, with community leaders, activists, and even skeptics agreeing that something needed to be done to acknowledge the journey. General Hayes and Officer Reynolds were once again thrust into the spotlight, but this time, they faced it as partners rather than adversaries. The town square, a space that had once felt charged with unease, was transformed into a vibrant hub of activity. Stalls were set up offering food from different cultures, local musicians played songs of unity, and children ran around with faces painted in bright colors. A stage stood at the center, where speeches and performances were planned throughout the day. It wasn't just an event, it was a celebration of resilience and growth. Hayes and Reynolds spent the morning walking among the crowd, greeting old friends and meeting new faces. The warmth and camaraderie in the air were almost surreal, given how fractured the community had once been. People approached them with gratitude, sharing stories of how the past year had changed their perspectives or inspired them to take action. A retired teacher spoke of how she had incorporated lessons on empathy and history into her curriculum. A local business owner shared how he had started hiring more inclusively, leading to a richer, more dynamic workplace. Even those who had initially resisted the town's efforts seemed to have softened, their conversations marked by curiosity rather than defensiveness. As the sun reached its zenith, the crowd gathered around the stage for the keynote address. Hayes and Reynolds took the stage together, their presence met with a standing ovation that neither had expected. Hayes stepped up to the microphone first, his deep, steady voice cutting through the applause. A year ago, he began, this town faced a moment of reckoning. What happened that day wasn't just about me or Officer Reynolds, it was about all of us. It forced us to confront the things we'd ignored, to have conversations we'd avoided, and to take a hard look at who we are as a community. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience. But what I see here today gives me hope. Not because we've solved all our problems, far from it. But because we've proven that change is possible when we choose to listen, to learn, and to grow. This is just the beginning, and I believe that together, we can continue building something truly extraordinary." The crowd erupted in applause, but it quickly quieted as Reynolds stepped forward. He took a deep breath, the weight of the moment evident in his expression. "I want to start by saying thank you," Reynolds said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for holding me accountable. Thank you for challenging me to be better. And thank you for giving me a second chance. A year ago, I couldn't see past my own defensiveness and pride. But this town, and especially General Hayes, showed me that admitting you were wrong isn't a weakness, it's a strength." He glanced at Hayes, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "And I want to thank this man right here. For his patience, his wisdom, and his willingness to see the good in me even when I couldn't see it myself." The applause that followed was thunderous, a cathartic release of the emotions that had been building throughout the day. As Hayes and Reynolds stepped down from the stage, they were met with handshakes, hugs, and even a few tears from the crowd. It was clear that their journey had become a symbol of what was possible, a beacon of hope for those still grappling with their own challenges. As the day turned to evening, the event culminated in the unveiling of a new monument in the town square. It was a simple yet powerful structure, a bridge made of polished stone, its arch engraved with the words, "United, we rise." At the base of the bridge were two plaques, one honoring General Hayes for his leadership and integrity, and the other acknowledging Officer Reynolds for his courage and humility. The monument was surrounded by a garden, its pathways designed to encourage reflection and conversation. In the glow of string lights and lanterns, the townspeople gathered around the monument, their voices hushed as they took in the sight. Hayes and Reynolds stood side by side, their faces lit with a mix of pride and gratitude. For Hayes, the moment was a testament to the power of perseverance and the belief that even the smallest actions could ripple outward, creating waves of change. For Reynolds, it was a reminder that redemption was not only possible but also deeply transformative. As the crowd began to disperse, Hayes and Reynolds found themselves sitting on a nearby bench, watching as families and friends lingered in the square. The air was filled with laughter, the kind of unguarded joy that had once felt out of reach. "You think we've done enough?" Reynolds asked, his tone thoughtful. Hayes smiled, shaking his head. "Enough? No. But we've done something. And sometimes, that's all it takes to spark a movement." Reynolds nodded, his gaze fixed on the monument. "It's strange. A year ago, I thought my life was over. Now, I feel like it's just beginning." Hayes clapped him on the shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "That's the thing about second chances, Jack. They don't just change your life, they change the lives of everyone around you." The two men sat in silence, the weight of the past year settling between them like an old friend. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges they couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time, they faced it with a sense of purpose and unity that felt unshakable. As the last of the crowd trickled away and the square grew quiet, Hayes and Reynolds stood, their silhouettes framed by the soft glow of the monument. Together, they walked into the night, their footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. A reminder that the bridges they had built weren't just physical structures but lasting connections forged in the crucible of change.